Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I look forward for the opportunity to ask some questions here and speak. My questions will be to our experts at the end of the table about technical questions specifically. And there is one kind of on the floor that was asked previously about the Benelli Super Vinci. Is this firearm listed in the prohibited list, yes or no?
So, as to the content of the schedule, I'm going to ask or defer to the Canadian Firearms Program because they are going to be able to provide you with accurate answers, more details. They're truly the technical experts, and I think it would benefit the committee to have their views and their knowledge and their expertise, so to better inform committee members to have constructive conversation and debate over the content of the schedule.
Thank you. I want to get back to some of the questions being asked around the proposed Part G and Government Motion 4. I want to make sure that I have my understanding correct. Part G essentially establishes a three-part test to whether a firearm is prohibited. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that test is separate and apart from the schedule made in reference to Part 1 that in motion in G46. To be clear, there is no language in Part G that requires a firearm to be listed in the schedule for G to apply. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now I want to walk through the three-part tests relatively quickly. The first is that a firearm is designed to fire center-fire ammunition, meaning, generally speaking, it fires a cartridge larger than 22 caliber, which would be a rimfire cartridge. Is that correct?
I don't know if that's correct,
Okay.
but we can come back to you with an answer.
There are 22s that are on the list, but it doesn't. That particular criteria says it isn't. So that's where some of the confusion begins.
Right.
Okay. Now the second test is that it fires the center fire round in a semi-automatic manner. That means that for each pull of the trigger, one projectile is issued down the barrel. This is distinct from other actions such as pump, bolt, or lever, which require the operation of a part other than the trigger to move around from the magazine into the chamber. And it is also distinct from an automatic firearm, which has long been prohibited under Canadian law, which fires many projectiles with one pull of the trigger. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And the last portion of the test is that the firearm is designed for use with a detachable magazine that could hold more than the allowed 5 rounds. Is that correct?
That's correct. The magazine has to be designed for that firearm. So it wouldn't be an aftermarket cartridge magazine, but so when the firearm is designed,
okay,
the cartridge magazine that goes with that firearm has to originally be capable of holding more than
So then to follow up with that question, we know of many firearms that are designed with they come in with a wood stock, and they have aftermarket stocks that can be changed to it's a plastic stock with a possible magazine that can hold possibly more than 5. Is that particular stock and magazine exempted from this, as you seem to lead to?
So what would determine whether or not one of these firearms falls within this definition or this qualitative criteria is when the firearm was originally designed. Mm-hmm. Was it designed to accept, at the time it was manufactured or designed, an oversized magazine cartridge, a cartridge magazine that's capable of holding more than 5 cartridges. Okay. So if there is another cartridge magazine or another magazine that was developed not specifically for that firearm, but it was capable of being used in that firearm, then that firearm would not fall within the definition unless, I know it's really confusing, unless there was a cartridge magazine
I agree.
designed for that. But the intent of purpose is to ensure that there's a static definition and that the classification of the firearm as prohibited, the classification of a firearm doesn't change based on aftermarket
Well,
magazines.
but you just said it possibly could, because is my impression. So if somebody was to add another part to that particular firearm, it potentially would be under the prohib restriction, where it isn't previously. If it's designed with a 5-round magazine maximum capacity, and somebody puts on an aftermarket stock and magazine, it sounds like you're saying that is exempted from this prohibition.
But- No.
I want to be very clear.
Right.
There's thousands of Canadians watching right now that are looking for these
That's great.
specifics because they're very concerned with what's going on. There's enough hunting firearms that are already on the list that we know are straight up hunting firearms. But I'll move on to my next technical question, but I'd appreciate an answer for that.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Just a friendly point of order.
Ms. Stench, on a point of order?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering, we have experts here, and we're very thankful that they are here, and they've been able to answer a number of questions for us. But given many of the questions from Liberals and ourselves and from the Bloc, we've been restrained in our access to get information. I'm just wondering if my honourable colleague would like to move an amendment to call for, I don't know, firearms program people that manage the firearms reference table and the schedules, or someone that could more quickly provide that advice, those who maybe drafted
Yes.
or crafted the list, for example?
I would
So
be. I
that
would
would
be,
not be an amendment to this
Motion.
amendment?
No, I'm asking, calling for perhaps a
And
motion.
we do have a motion on the floor, so we can't move a separate amendment. But I can, I'll certainly get with the clerk and see if we can arrange for someone from the,
Yeah, and maybe I would ask the witnesses, if some of the questions, if they're not being able to be answered, especially the technical ones that you're supposed to be here to be able to answer. And, I can't fault somebody not knowing what they don't know, right? But I would highly suggest that you would have somebody here that, as my colleague, Ms. Dancho, has requested, that can fully answer some of these very technical questions.
We're here to answer questions related to the motion.
So
And
are
the
you going to
legal
make the
aspects?
move and have those witnesses, as requested, come to help testify?
so
That's not on me.
Mr. Zimmer, that's really not up to
Okay.
the witnesses to
Okay.
But we will, I will get with the clerk and see if we can invite someone from the Canadian Firearms Program to attend in future.
Point of order along those lines, Chair, if you will. Yeah, I think Ms. Doncho's point is well taken, and there's been questions on both sides that, in fairness to our witnesses, they're not, they were given information, they don't understand necessarily why, and that's not their role. So if we could have technical experts from the Canadian Firearms Program to be, join this group at our next meeting, that would
I believe
be
I
ideal.
just said that we would seek to do that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll
Mr.
go
Zimmer,
on to
carry on,
my
please.
questions. I have many more. And it's kind of the same question, but here we go. I'm sure that, the way magazines and firearms interoperate is based on the size of the magazine port. And being a firearms owner myself, I know this is the case. In other words, could a firearm that has a magazine port of a certain size, in theory, accept any magazine that is the same size, including the one that is not pinned or otherwise limited per Canadian law?
There's no prohibition in Canadian law for a firearm to, there's no prohibition in the criminal code for using a firearm that's greater than, that's not prohibited. So for using a cartridge magazine that's non-prohibited, there's no restrictions on how these
Okay.
magazine cartridges are used in certain
Okay,
other
I'm
firearms.
going to get into a question about variants, and
Okay.
it's kind of on the same topic, but maybe it'll become more clear. And the reason that I asked, it appears that the limit of five cartridges is redundant if the third part of the test simply bans the firearms with detachable magazines, because there could be, at any time or place, a magazine that is larger than 5 rounds that fits the magazine port. And that's the sort of the premise of what we're asking, and there was similar questions asked about Butler Creek magazines a few years ago, where other similar magazines were Butler Creek magazines were prohibited, but these other particular, almost identical magazines were not. And a very confusing situation for firearms owners.
It is. I mean, the way that cartridge magazines are determined whether or not they're prohibited, it's based on the firearm for which they were designed.
Yeah, I hear
right?
that.
So sometimes there are dual-use magazines.
Yeah.
So, or you'll have a magazine that's designed for a handgun but could hold, or is designed for a rifle but can be used in a handgun. But
Yeah.
it's the firearm, the firearm that was the firearm. It depends on the firearm that the magazine was designed for.
Okay. I'll go to my next question. So we've established what G does, namely it bans firearms that discharge centerfire ammunition, that do so in a semi-automatic manner, and that have a detachable magazine. But I'm going to ask you another question. Are you familiar with the firearms reference table?
Yes, I am.
For those who are not, the Firearms Reference Table is a database maintained by the RCMP and the Canadian Firearms Program, and firearms verifiers that outlines the details of all types of firearms that have been imported into Canada or have been built in Canada. It includes details like the three-part test for the gun ban in G: ammunition type, action, and magazine design. Question: have you run a report on the FRT to determine the amount of models of firearms that will be impacted by G?
That is a question that is best answered by the Canadian Firearms Program. So
Okay.
I would,
Are you able to answer it now?
no, I'm not.
Okay. Another question. I've come into possession of a report from the FRT produced by our firearms business that's familiar to me, who searched for precisely these criteria and found that there are 514 models of firearms that are prohibited by this amendment. Can you comment on that?
Again, I would refer you to the Canadian Firearms Program because their technical experts are best
Okay.
placed to answer those questions.
I can
for you.
provide that information to you if you wish, or the committee. So we understand that there are many types of firearms, most non-restricted, that meet this new criteria. But to understand the scope of that change, we actually need to dive in further. The term variant is often used in relation to firearms classification, but it is undefined in legislation, despite the best efforts of my former colleague, Larry Miller, and that was brought up by my colleague previously in this committee meeting, Mr. Ruff. Yet it is often used throughout the FRT, ironically. Could you provide a definition of variant to this committee?
There is no definition of variant in law. It's a term of art.
Could you tell us how many variants of the 514 models of firearms will also be prohibited based on this amendment?
I cannot provide you with that information, but I would redirect you to the Canadian Firearms Program.
Okay. And once again, I would hope that they would be present to be able to answer these very technical, very important questions. The reason I ask is because it seems that the variant is a very loosely defined term, and you said it's not defined even in legislation. I'll give you an example. The Mossberg 715T is a .22 caliber rifle. It is identical in structure and operation to the Mossberg 702 rifle. The one difference is that where the Mossberg 702 has a more traditional looking wood furniture on the exterior, the Mossberg 715T has a plastic shell. The reason I mention this is because for years and years, the 702 and 715 were non-restricted. And then a few years ago, the government decided it was a variant of the AR-15 and thus restricted, even though the exact same firearm without the plastic shell was non-restricted. And then further, the government listed the 715 in the May Order in Council, making it a prohibited firearm and putting it in the bizarre position of having the guts of the firearm both simultaneously non-restricted and prohibited. Government attempts to address this in Amendment G46 by making the Mossberg 702 Plinkster a listed prohibited firearm, a .22. And I know the Liberal Party is saying there's no .22s affected by this legislation. There absolutely is, and here's one example. As an aside, I'm sure that banning firearms designed for shooting pop cans and squirrels is exactly what will stop the 92% increase in gang homicides under this particular government. And it's not funny. All of this to say, can you comment on the situation where without a legal definition, the term variant seems to have been stretched to include such tangential connection as having a similar superficial physical appearance?
So what I can answer for you, your question is important, and thank you for that. What I can answer for you is that the term variant is used by the Canadian Firearms Program to guide their own technical analyses as to whether or not a specific firearm is a variant of a listed or otherwise prohibited firearm.
Even though you've acknowledged already there's no legal definition.
So it's a technical criteria. It's
Okay. Another example under this proposed amendment, the Remington 870 DM. 870 is a very common shotgun used by many duck hunters and farmers across this country. I've had one myself previously, with a detachable magazine. That is center fire, which would fit this definition. Would this mean that all Remington 870 shotguns be prohibited as variants, even though the rest of the 870 variants are pump action shotguns?
So it's not possible for me to comment on a specific make and model of a firearm. I would, again, refer you back to the Canadian Firearms Program. What I can answer for you is that the schedule lists firearms by make and model, and it also lists all known variants in the schedule. So,
But we already discussed that even 46 isn't necessarily exhaustive based on that 3-point criteria, correct?
I'm sorry, can you read?
I'll just keep going. At my time, we're just about
Yeah.
done, so I'll keep going. I just would, again, these are more, I have more important questions that need to be answered, and I'll try and get through them today. In a similar vein, many center fire semi-automatic rifles are also chambered in the .22 caliber rimfire ammunition. Would all rimfire variants of a center fire rifle become prohibited?
Under the definition? Or,
Under this legislation, C21,
So-
and amendments.
so the definition itself, so the G does not apply to rimfire firearms.
Except the Plinkster that I already just mentioned. It's actually in G46.
So it's attached to the schedule?
Yes.
So the schedule does include some rimfire firearms, so.
Okay. That seems inconsistent with what we've been promised by this government. So I'll go into 16. I'll go into my next question. In the definition, if the definition can be stretched in that way, can you confirm what variants of firearms that meet this new 3-part test will be captured? Because I think that's what the mystery out there for Canadian firearms owners and hunters is, if it's not on the list, am I the next one to be on that list?
Right.
Am I okay?
So most of the known assault rifles that are in Canada would be captured currently in the schedule.
Okay.
The G, the criteria set out in G, overlaps with most of the firearms set in the schedule, but it doesn't include all of them.
Right.
Because in the schedule, there are some rimfire firearms that would not
So,
be
so
included.
I'll move on to my
Sure.
next before I run out of time. But so if you're confused a little bit, and
I'm-
we're confused in this room a little bit, you can just imagine the folks that just own farms that don't have the expertise that possibly we do in this room. So I better keep going. Given that many, if not most, of the firearms that are banned under G are previously non-restricted, it will certainly be a challenge to inform individuals of the new obligations and the status of their property. As mentioned, with the end of the long gun registry, presumably there's no way of contacting any individuals based on the firearms they own. But under the system established by Bill C21 that required all transfers of non-restricted firearms, even between two individuals, to be recorded with the RCMP, will that data be useful in tracking down the owners of newly prohibited firearms?
So, okay, I can speak to Bill C71 and the transfer requirements for individuals, which is that.
I'm asking specifically about what, will that data be useful in tracking down the owners of newly prohibited firearms? Yes or no?
Thank you for that question. So Bill C71 included a license verification requirement, which is that people have to verify in with the RCMP before they transfer.
I know what the data is.
But
I'm
there's-
asking,
they
will it
don't-
be
Point of order,
useful?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Zimmer, please let the witness
I
answer the
just see
question.
my time, Mr. Chair.
No information on the firearm that is being transferred. All it is about the individual in terms of verifying that their license is still active.
So what you're saying, that data, I'll just ask, it's just a yes or no. Will that data be useful in tracking down the owners of the newly prohibited firearms? Yes or no?
As I indicated, there is no information about the firearm that is being transferred. Therefore, no, there is no information being held at the RCMP with regards. It's all about the individuals and that their license is valid. There's
Thank
no
you.
information about the firearm.